Hello and welcome to SI5 Improvement, the brand new podcast bringing you supreme intelligence to self-improvement. With high performance from everyday people, because I truly believe that everyone has something that they've accomplished that they can share with others to help the listeners improve. So, the first guest on this podcast is myself, Harry Edward Basson. Harry, welcome to the show. Oh, thank you, Harry. Nice to have you here. Well, you're welcome, Harry. You've got a success story to share. Indeed, I have, Harry. Indeed, I have. So, let's start it off. My success story. Now, I was a completely different person when my dad was diagnosed with motor neurone disease and frontal lobe dementia. He was diagnosed with frontal lobe dementia in September 2019, and 1 month later in October was further diagnosed with motor neurone disease. So when he was diagnosed with frontal lobe dementia, he was given 8 years to live. 1 month later, they noticed muscle weakness and diagnosed him with MND, and that gave him 2 years to live. And he died 2 years to the day of his diagnosis. Now, the man I was when he was diagnosed was a totally different person to who I was at the time of his death 2 years later. And so my success story comes over that 2 year bracket of losing my dad to MND. Now, I'm going to talk about, first of all, who I was as a person before my dad was diagnosed. For many years, throughout my 20s, firstly, I was an alcoholic. Now, I wasn't waking up and reaching for the nearest bottle of vodka, but after work, every day, I'd stop off at the off licence and pick up 8 cans of Stella. Near enough every day, near enough. Maybe 5 days out of 7. I didn't think I had a problem with alcohol at the time, because I'd gone periods where I hadn't drank. If I was trying to stick to a diet, I might have gone a couple of weeks. But in general, I drank too much. And that also contributed to my obesity. So I was almost 20 stone in weight. I couldn't run for more than 30 seconds. I couldn't get up a mountain. I was out of breath walking up the stairs. And my job was a warehouseman at the time, and I couldn't even lift the box up the stairs without panting when I got to the top. This made me incredibly self-conscious, because I was always aware of my weight, and I was always worried what other people were thinking. I just thought they were thinking horrible thoughts about my physical appearance. And it got to the point where I couldn't even take the bins out of my flat down to the car park, to the bins, and put my bin sack in the bin, because I was in fear that there'd be a neighbour looking out of their window thinking, look how fat he is at number 21. And so I used to leave it until it got dark, and then I'd go outside to put my bins out. That's how self-conscious I was at that time in my life. I had health issues. Now, at the time of my dad's diagnosis in September/October, my drinking and negativity and depression became even worse. I just found out I was losing my dad. And it got to the point in December where I got blood tests back from the doctor to say I had liver damage. I had liver enzymes in my blood, and that only happens when your liver's damaged. And I had very high cholesterol from the junk food. I had a severe body itch all over my body. It could have been a diabetic itch. I'm not sure what it was. It could have been a diabetic itch. It could have been a stress response to the fact I had a breakdown when I first realised my dad had MND and what it was going to do to him. So I had this massive itch as well. So physically, mentally, I was just not in a great place at all. Um, I also had no wisdom. Like, I didn't know how to deal with such a thing of losing my dad. I didn't know how to sort myself out. I tried so many times to stick to a diet, to stop drinking, to try and be positive, to try and exercise. And I could never do it for long enough. I always, like, the first hurdle, and that would be me giving up. Like, I didn't have any tools or any wisdom in my locker to think of how to overcome when that temptation hits, or when this obstacle arises, or when this hardship is faced. I didn't have any wisdom at that point in my life. I was constantly unhappy. I was negative because I was so unhappy. And that negativity I was portraying outwards to everybody all the time. I just wanted to sit at home and drink and watch the football and eat a pizza. Like, I wasn't doing anything else with my life. I wasn't being productive. I wasn't building anything. I wasn't using my creativity. I was just literally surviving through every single day. And it was the beer and the junk food that was helping me to self-soothe, to get me through each day, because I was so unhappy. And then my dad was diagnosed. At that point, I was already like this at that point. And then my dad was diagnosed with dementia. And then he was diagnosed with MND. And it got to a point where I didn't want to face the future because I was in fear. I looked ahead on some YouTube video that I watched of some man who was in his last stages of MND. And I suddenly realised at that point, I was in the bath at the time, and I was watching it on my phone, and I knew MND was a really bad thing to have. I just didn't know exactly what it would imply later on in the last days of my dad's life. When I saw this video of this man, I broke down. I just remember crying, and I've never ever cried like this before, and I never ever will cry like this again. But I cried as if I was yelling, as if I'd just broken my leg. That's how I would explain the crying. And I remember I tried to get out of the bath, and I just collapsed on the bathroom floor, just crying my eyes out. I couldn't believe that my dad was having to go through, in probably a year's time, the death that he was about to face. So I ended up drinking even heavily, becoming even more negative, becoming depressed, and fearing the future more than I've ever feared the future. Like, it was like the walls were caving in on me, as they probably were for my dad and anybody else who suffers with MND. It's like you're on this time thing. Like, there's a limit to your life, and it just feels like every day these walls are caving in on you. And that's how I felt, even though I didn't have MND. This is how I felt my life was now, because I loved my dad more than anything in the whole entire world. And I couldn't cope with this. I was in real fear of the future. I didn't want to have to face it. And I found myself, in all honesty, on the train platform at midnight, drunk out of my brain. And I wasn't intending to do anything stupid, but I was just desperate, and I didn't know what to do. And I ended up going home that night and sobered up. But I knew that I had to be the best son I could be for my dad. I think my girlfriend at the time, Claire, and maybe my best friend as well, Grant, I think they both said to me that, like, if I was to let myself get worse and worse and worse, or worse than that, like, my dad needed me. And I didn't want my dad to feel like MND was killing him as well as killing his son, or ruining his son's life from an illness that is not his fault. He's been such a great dad to me my entire life, such a role model, such an inspiration. And now here he is, with MND and his son's going off on a complete rampage, flushing his life down the toilet. How guilty would my dad feel knowing that he was dying and also it was because of him that his son's life was ruined? I didn't want my dad to feel that guilt because he didn't deserve to feel that guilt. So I knew that I had to sort myself out in order to be the best son that I could possibly be for my dad in the last 2 years of his life. There is no control over MND. There is no cure. The doctors cannot do anything, and neither could I. And the only control I could grip onto was being the best son that I could possibly be for my dad and making him proud. That triggered my transformation. Now, there was one night in Harpenden. It was about late December 2019. This was the period where I was still in a really bad place. And I went to my friend Gary's. I just needed a few beers. I needed to get out of my flat. I needed to play the PlayStation. And we did. We used to play this drinking game, right? Where we used to play FIFA. And whoever conceded a goal had to down his beer, right? Now, I was downing my beer anyway, even if I didn't score a goal, if I didn't concede a goal, because I was in such a depressive mood that I was just downing my beer anyway. So the game was kind of irrelevant. But it got to the point I wasn't enjoying. Usually we had a great laugh, me and Gary. We used to have a right laugh playing FIFA and having a few beers like it is when you're in your 20s. And it just got to the point where I wasn't enjoying myself. So Gary said, "Look, Harry, come on, let's go out. Let's go out to the pub." So we went out. It was chucking it down with rain, as it always seemed to be the case in Harpenden. Every time I went round Gary's house, it was raining. We went to a pub. I couldn't get a seat, and I just started moaning. And I was just completely like negative. I was acting aggressive, and I left before I got into a fight, because I knew it was a possibility that would happen. So I left and I staggered into Sainsbury's drunk, and I thought I'm going to go and get a bottle of pink gin. And I don't even know why, because I don't drink pink gin, but I picked up a bottle of pink gin. And I staggered through Sainsbury's, blurry vision. I was approaching the checkout where there was this book stand. And in the corner of my eye, bearing in mind that I couldn't face the fear of losing my dad, in the corner of my eye, I saw the word fear in big red letters. And then I saw the title, How to Harness Your Fear and Live Without Limits. Now, I know that this is a bit of an egotistical thing, and I might sound even a little bit sexist in saying this, but I know things have changed recently, but a man to admit his fear is quite difficult. And I personally wouldn't have picked up a book about how to harness your fear, because at that time in my life, I was under the impression that men shouldn't be fearful. Like, we should just face everything, get on with it, and I'm a macho geezer, right? So I wouldn't have picked up a book. However, Ant Middleton, who's an ex-SAS soldier, his face was on the cover of this book, staring straight at me with a serious look on his face. And that caught my attention, because all of a sudden, there's one of the world's most famous, fearsome ex-SAS soldiers who's been on the summit of Mount Everest, been to prison and out of prison, and started his own television show. One of the toughest blokes in the country, and he's talking about fear. And he said himself that he feels fear all the time. He's not fearless like people say he is. He feels fear all the time. And he says, without fear, there is no challenge. Without challenge, there is no growth. And without growth, there is no life. And that appealed to me, and I picked the book up, The Fear Bubble. And I read it. And that really helped me to apply some new tactics and some new mindsets from one of the most successful people in overcoming fear to apply to my own life in using it to face the fear of losing my dad. That humongously helped me. I quit alcohol. I knew it couldn't serve me. If I was to become the best son I could be for my dad, alcohol had to have no part in my life. It didn't provide me with anything apart from temporary enjoyment of an evening. And that temporary enjoyment often came with long-term misery. So I quit alcohol. I started dieting. I was almost 20 stone. And throughout 2020, I lost 6.5 stone. I got down to 13.5 stone. I was climbing mountains because I had now this fitness and this new. I was always sober and I was always healthy. So naturally, I became more positive, and I wanted to use my number one, the fitness that I now had. I wanted to use it, so I started climbing mountains. But also, I wanted to use mountains in a way to face my fear because I'm scared of heights. And I wanted to face my fear of heights as a practice for facing the fear of losing my dad, if that makes sense. I kind of like, it was like practicing to face the fear and facing it no matter what. And there was a mountain in particular, Helvellyn, in the Lake District. Striding Edge takes you to the summit of Helvellyn, one of the routes. It's a knife edge scramble. One that me and my friend Gary went on in 2018, and I had to turn back and go home because I couldn't face the fear. When I got to one particular point, I looked ahead and I couldn't face the fear of climbing up to that summit of Helvellyn or scrambling along that knife edge. But when I went back in 2020 in August, it was on purpose to face this fear. And I always liken Helvellyn to my dad's journey. I went back and I thought, do you know what? I haven't got a choice in facing losing my dad. I haven't got a choice. I can't just turn back and go back down the mountain of that road. I have to face this journey. And that's exactly the approach I took when I went back to Helvellyn on my own, nobody holding my hand, to walk across this knife edge scramble up to the summit on my own without any possibility of turning back. Now, I also started running. It was during the lockdown. I was furloughed, and I used that opportunity of time to run. And I went out every day. I started off, couldn't run more than 30 seconds. I did the Couch to 5K NHS running program, a brilliant program. If you can't run at all, you start off level 1 by running for 1 minute and then walking for 2 minutes and then running for 1 minute, walking for 2 minutes. And it gradually builds you up and up and up throughout the weeks until you can run a 5K. It's called Couch to 5K on the NHS. Go on the NHS website and just Google it. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant if you want to start. But that's what I did. And I was stop, start. Eventually, I could run 5K and started doing those 5K park runs. I met a girlfriend because I was more positive and confident. My self-esteem was now rising. I was no longer afraid to take the bins out to the car park. And I met a girlfriend. I was confident. And that was also a fearful thing. It was like, it was nervous. It took you a lot of guts to go and meet someone and date someone for the first time. And I remember thinking before the date, I was 50-50 whether I was going to go through with it. And it was a test. And I did it. And I overcome it. Because I was in a more positive frame of mind and I felt better with I think I'd lost about 2.5 stone at that point. So I was building momentum. And so I started dating Claire. I also went back to the doctors and had blood tests. My liver was now fully functionable, no problems at all. It had healed. My cholesterol levels were now down to a completely safe and healthy level. My all body itch had gone. And I was now looking brilliant. My face was glowing. I was positive. And that led me on to picking up another book. After I'd read The Fear Bubble, I now had this bromance with Ant Middleton because he'd completely switched my mindset through his techniques that he was sharing with me through the pages of his book. And he released another book at the end of 2020 called Zero Negativity. So I'd faced my fears and I was improving my health and my positivity was increasing, but now I wanted to take it to the next level. And reading that book really did push me on in terms of my positivity and the way I was handling situations. And I ran half a marathon in the end of that year. It was in November 2020. I'd got so fit from the running and the park runs. I now attempted my first virtual half a marathon because we were still in a lockdown at this point. And that was the last time when my dad saw his son accomplish. He was there at the end, and he watched me come in on my last 100 yards, and he couldn't stop laughing with proudness. It was a thoroughly enjoyable moment for my dad. And just 1 month later, he really deteriorated. So it was the last point of 2020 before he ended up going into a care home. He was still active and himself as much as he could be at that point. It was just the last moment we had together, and we took a photo, and I had the medal, and I thought if it wasn't for my dad, I would not have had that medal. A very proud moment. I pushed myself into a new job. I was a warehouse operative, and in my last company, had some managerial experience, but I was cheap transferred. I wasn't feeling like my potential was being hit. I felt like I was being caged up in a prison, and I just felt I needed to escape. And I'd been in that job for about 12, 13 years, since I was 20. So to leave was another fearful situation. And I had to have the confidence in my abilities to push myself into become a warehouse manager, which was something I always wanted to become properly, without any monkeys on my back dictating what I had to do. I wanted a free hand. I was given that. I joined this new company and I felt happy. I felt like my qualities I could now express. Another fearful situation that I put myself in because of the man I was becoming. And I continue to look for challenges. It doesn't matter what the challenge could be. I've now summited, I think, 13 of the UK's highest mountains. And I've gone to Morocco and summited Mount Toubkal, which is the highest mountain in North Africa. So my continuing improving continues to grow. I love challenges. I've just completed a 75 hard mental toughness program. I like to run half marathons and just do all these things to push myself, continue to grow. Now, none of that would have been possible if it wasn't for losing my dad and for the journey that I'm now going on. So, when it comes to the point of my dad's death, I remember going out in the morning of his funeral, and I ran first thing in the morning, and I went to his funeral, and I thought, do you know what? I want to be the most positive person in the whole of the crematorium, because that's exactly who my dad used to be, the most positive person I knew. And I wanted to portray his personalities as a father and act that way as his son. And I delivered a lovely speech on his behalf, and once again, a really proud moment. And it was actually, I call that the happiest day of my life, because so many people were there to learn about who my dad was, to celebrate his life. And he had so many friends and family that were there. And this was in the middle of a lockdown as well. So it was very limited to the spaces that we were allowed at that point due to social distancing. But it was so great for a son to see his dad so loved. And I achieved what I set out to do. The only control I had was to make my dad the proudest dad he could possibly be. And he died feeling enormously proud of his son. And I'm just looking down now, actually. It's if you're listening to the audio, you won't be able to see this. But if you're on the YouTube platform, I've got this stand here. I'm just going to show the camera. It's my dad. I am always with you. And a picture of my dad on a piece of Perspex. And I'm having that on my desk because even during this podcast, I like to think that my dad's somewhere watching me and proud of me with a smile on his face. So I continue to make. I made a promise to my dad on his deathbed that I would continue to improve and to continue to try and make him proud and continue to try and be successful. That was one of the promises I made him. And this podcast is all about that. It's all about just trying to improve. And now I promote self-improvement and healthy living to other people, which is why it's so important to share this episode to as many people as you can, to try and spread this message that everyday people just like me can somehow have a positive impact on someone who might be struggling. They might be in the place that I was back in 2019, and they just need some advice and some motivation. So please share it with them and subscribe to this podcast. Now, I'm not perfect. And even though I went on this transformation, there are times where my natural groove, I tend to fall back into it again. You know, I spent a long time, don't forget, before my dad's diagnosis, throughout my whole of the 20s, being obese, drinking too much alcohol, eating too much junk food, being negative. And so I spent so long in that lifestyle that even now I'm trying to be this better person, and I'll always strive to be. There are times where I might have a bad day, slip up with temptation, and I fall back into my old groove. Now, I haven't given into the alcohol. I've been off alcohol now for 4.5 years. But junk food I can tend to go back to. Even negative traits I can tend to go back to. I'm not pretending to be perfect. I'm not pretending to be some massive inspiration. I do feel like I've got an inspirational story to tell between 2020 and 2022. And since then, I have been a little bit up and down. You know, it's just human. Like, don't feel like, as well, if you want to come on this podcast and share your story, don't feel like a hypocrite if you're currently not in alignment to a success that you had in the past, because it's not that you're portraying a fakeness. It's not that you're portraying to be someone that you're not anymore. We all try to do our best. And sometimes we don't do our best. And that's not because we're being fake or because we're putting on an act. This is because we're human beings, and we all have imperfections. We all have battles with our mental health. We have temptations that the world seems to just place in front of us all the time. And it can derail us, and we don't always act the way that we should act, and we don't always feel the way that we'd like to feel. But it's all about striving to be your best. So if you've got a story to tell, please don't feel like you're not good enough to tell it. You are. Please contact me and come on this podcast and share what you've got to offer the world. I'm not perfect, but I want to continue improving. That's my inner desire. And sometimes external factors and my own mental imperfections get in the way of that desire. But that desire will never change. I've promised my dad. I want to be this positive person. I want to portray a positive message out into the world. I want to do something positive, not just for me, but for other people. Because I spent so long not doing anything positive for anybody. And if I can try and get this out here, I don't care if this channel grows to the point where I'm generating income from it. Do you know what? Sometimes just having a purpose raises your mental well-being. And for me personally, this is what I am personally getting from doing this podcast. I have a purpose. And sometimes a purpose is all you need. And my purpose to improve myself was my dad. But you don't need someone to die to have a purpose. Because at the end of the day, what it strips down to, the fundamentals, I wanted to be the best son I could be for my dad because I valued his life. And he wanted me to do well as his son because he valued my life. That's the fundamental. We have a purpose, and that is our life. That is our purpose, to try and get the best out of it, to live as happy as we can, and improving ourselves is only going to contribute to our growth and happiness. So, yes, thank you for listening to my story. That is my story. That is a lot about myself. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your stories. Really am, because I still take advice from anybody I can to add to my own personal growth. So I think the next guest we've got on this podcast is Georgina McKim. She's a life coach. She's definitely got a story to tell and loads of valuable wisdom and advice. So stay tuned for that episode coming up in the near future. And yeah, look, guys, girls, this is really my opportunity and anybody that is a guest on this podcast's opportunity to provide the listeners of this podcast with supreme intelligence to self-improvement.